have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
Coming up this week.
As Vladimir Putin meets Kim Jong Un, big trade plans are afoot, much to the chagrin of Western leaders. Seems like we're about to answer an important question. What happens when the collective set of people you've sanctioned gets so large that they can all successfully trade with each other? Which invites yet another question. Did no one think of this?
Javier Milei decided he would rip the Band-Aid off Argentinian inflation. Now, finally, beneath that Band-Aid, we can see a gaping wound. Inflation is coming down, but in this case, what comes down must go up. We'll be explaining why the crazy one's apparent success in containing the money supply is about to lead to another run on the peso.
Finally, last week, the EU was assailed by a wave of populists. It all felt suitably dramatic, a blow against the blob. But have you ever punched a blob before? As the permanent Brussels Mandarin class regroups, it's time for the Empire Strikes Back.
But first,
trade, axis of evil. So this week, Russian President Vladimir Putin visited Kim Jong Un in North Korea. It had been announced a few days ago, but I think it was a little bit of a surprise trip in a lot of ways. It wasn't as widely advertised and so on as some of the other trips that Putin's taken recently, of which there have been quite a few, China, obviously. I would say that the Western media are starting to catch up with the Multipolarity podcast. The CNN World headline is Russia's Putin arrives in North Korea for rare trip as anti-West alignment deepens. So they're clearly kind of figuring out that there's something actually going on in the world, which is nice because we've been told that nothing happening, bros, for a very long time now. So I think it's becoming kind of undeniable that things are happening. I suppose the most interesting thing about the trip, really, apart from the fact that it was undertaken at all, Putin was reported to have said, I think in the speech, or maybe it was in a newspaper article he wrote, that he wanted to bring North Korea into this new payment system block that the Russians have actually been kind of taking point on since the sanctions. Everyone's been talking about alternative payment systems and alternative currencies and so on. But Russia's really been the country that's taken the lead on it. And unsurprisingly, because their financial system has been frozen out of SWIFT and so on. So they've actually had to take an active role in it. So I would read this first. So there's a lot of interesting aspects to this. But the first thing I'd say about that is that this could be the first test case, right? So we've seen that Russia can survive outside the SWIFT system, and it can survive with minimal usage of dollars. We've also had some news about the Russian stock market recently, which is related, that dollar usage is going to go even further down. Maybe we can talk about that in a moment. But the point is, they've been able to get by without access to the global dollar-based payment system. We know that now. We have 2.5 years of evidence of that. And I think all the people who said that the ruble is going to imminently collapse, I think they've disappeared one by one. I haven't seen one hanging around for a while, although you never know, there may be one under the bed. But the real next question for this new payment system is, could you break a contained economy that's a lot smaller out of its containment? And that's how I'd read President Putin's comments about opening North Korea up to these payment systems. Because presumably, once North Korea is open to these payment systems, pretty much anyone can do trade with North Korea via Russia at that point. Maybe there'll be slight cost differentials if you want to import North Korean products from Russia, sure. But you can do it. And if North Korea is as poor as we're told, and I think it probably is that poor, it can produce industrial goods for very, very cheap. It's obviously sending Russia an awful lot of artillery shells at the moment, so they can produce stuff like that. So in theory, with that kind of industrial equipment, North Korea may be able to produce very basic components for industry. And my assumption will be, if the Russians start to develop these new payment systems in North Korea that will allow North Korea to start selling maybe cheap, very, very cheap, very basic products into Russia, into Russian industry, which in itself is on the way up at the moment. We know about the Russian industrial upswing. Well, North Korea will be able to sell into that. Now, it'll be probably very basic, nuts and bolts almost in terms of sophistication, sure, at the start, although maybe they have some more interesting components from their missile program. But, even if they're just selling really cheap nuts and bolts or like really basic, steel widgets or whatever, I mean, that kind of actually starts opening the economy up. They're also opening the whole place up to tourism and so on. It really does look like Russia and North Korea are going to form quite a close relationship. And that in itself is a huge surprise. I think most of us who grew up with North Korea being the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, DPRK, never really thought that it would stop being a hermit kingdom. But it feels to me that, given the fact that North Korea's population is 26 million, it's not a huge country. Opening that up to, a country the size of Russia, just doing that could have major ramifications for the North Korean economy, which, as I said, already has a pretty, I wouldn't say sophisticated, but it has an industrial base. Now, it's mainly producing military equipment at the moment, but that can be turned to other usages. So I'd say this is a huge deal from a number of different perspectives. But the one really to watch out for is, will these new payment systems facilitate trade between Russia and North Korea? I mean, we can give you an answer on that. Yes, it will. I mean, payment systems are very primitive technology. They're like 1970s technology. So it will work, but it'll be very interesting. It's a real-time economic experiment to see. You have a heavily sanctioned economy. The main sanctions are being done through the financial system, and suddenly there's an alternative financial system. What we will learn from the North Korean experiment will tell us an awful lot about how global payment systems and financial systems may pan out as the multipolar world emerges.
That's actually very interesting, and without meaning to sound rude, a lot more interesting than I thought it was going to be. The idea of North Korea as an experiment to see what happens when a heavily sanctioned country with really next to no contact with the outside world comes into contact with the new trading and payments and financial architecture that the Russians are trying to build. Seems to me actually quite fascinating. It could be a genuinely interesting natural experiment over the next few years. I mean, in general terms, Philip, it is fair to say that the damage that the Western policy toward the Russian Federation has done to the West itself never seems to end. Obviously, we've spoken a lot on this podcast about the damage that it's done to the European Union, especially, also the Western diplomatic position. And I think that's becoming far better known in the mainstream media, and slowly it's seeping through into the general populace in Europe, as we might see later in this podcast. However, I think increasingly people are becoming aware that it is also affecting what in the past was actually a pretty damaging and effective financial weapon that the US and Europe held, which was namely the ability to sanction countries and then impose secondary sanctions on countries that dealt with those, or organizations indeed that dealt with those countries. Although it always struck me as being the equivalent of strategic bombing, in that it did a whole load of damage but didn't actually achieve what the sanctioning country hoped it would achieve, i.e. bringing these countries around to the US or European position. Cuba didn't come around to that position. Iran didn't come around to that position. Venezuela hasn't come around to that position. But there's no doubt about it, they did do a huge amount of damage. And I think it's fair to say that they've done a huge amount of damage to the North Korean economy as well. However, the Western policy toward Russia, it's almost been the straw that broke the camel's back, or maybe the little kind of finger that's come out of the dam, essentially, because now that Russia is sanctioned as well, and has been forced to build relations elsewhere in the world, it seems to have been like some sort of keystone state, essentially, where removing it has brought the whole thing crashing down. And countries like Iran and North Korea are making hay, even as Russia itself grows faster than any Western economy and with very little in the way of fiscal deficit. I mean, a lower fiscal deficit certainly than France, Britain, and the US. And yet it's growing faster than France and Britain, and I believe as well the US this year. It's an astonishing record of failure. It's the damage is just incredible, and more gets unearthed as we, start digging through the rubble of this policy. Obviously, briefly in terms of Russia and North Korea, it makes a lot of sense for those two countries to improve their relations and trade more together. And the reason I say that isn't the obvious reason. Actually, I think it makes a lot of sense because it allows each to reduce their dependency on China. South Korea has been dependent on China, and Russia is to a certain degree dependent on China, although that's very much a two-way street, given Russia's a natural resources superpower and also has a range of military technology that the Chinese would no doubt be interested in as well. But North Korea certainly is reliant on Russia, and by trading with each other, they allow themselves to reduce by just a little bit their dependence on China. And what really kicked this off, again, going back to Western policies, if people remember, last year, the US was running incredibly short of ammunition, and especially 155mm artillery. So what did it do? It emptied out an artillery store in the Middle East, which seems rather foolish now, given what's going on in Israel. And it also started pressuring South Korea, it started pressuring Seoul to sell artillery to Ukraine. But Seoul said, well, we have laws in place that prevent us from selling artillery to foreign powers, especially in times of war. And the US put a huge amount of political pressure on them and created some elaborate scheme to allow the South Koreans to do that, where basically they would loan the artillery to the United States, and the United States would then be able to send its artillery to Ukraine. Russia warned the South Koreans that if they did this, they would be forced, or they would have nothing anymore to stop them from improving relations with the North Koreans. The South Koreans and the Americans, of course, didn't listen, so the Russians improved relations with the North Koreans. This not only improves the North Korean economy, as you very interestingly highlighted, but it also makes the South Korean position rather more difficult because Russia really can offer a significant amount of support and military technology to South Korea. So, yeah, I mean, again, I'll say it is difficult to overestimate the damage that the Western sanctions policy against Russia has wrought for the West itself.
Yeah, just to kind of pick up on that point. So if you look into the North Korean sanctions, the more recent ones, basically since the turn of the millennia, I'd say the early 2000s is when I think a lot of the more modern ones got going. Obviously, the country's been sanctioned for a very long time, but it was in response to their nuclear program, which is really in the past 2 decades or so. And what you find is actually that Russia has been a pretty consistent sanctioner. It goes back at least to 2010, when the then president Dmitry Medvedev signed a decree implementing intensified United Nations Security Council sanctions against their nuclear programs. 2013, Russia joined the sanctions against North Korea again, introduced by the UN Security Council. And even in 2017, Putin signed a presidential decree imposing even more sanctions on North Korea. Just to remind you, or remind your listeners, 2017 is 3 years after the Russian takeover of Crimea. So at that point, Russia's not in the situation it's currently in, obviously, but it's under sanctions. It's kind of seen as a bit of a pariah in the West, not as much as it is today, but it is. And Putin still signs on to the sanctions. So even the fact that they are undertaking this cooperation goes completely against the last 15 years of Russian-North Korean relations. So even without all the other stuff that you mentioned, that's a pretty big loss, especially given the fact that, as I said at the beginning, I think that, even just opening up Russia, and if you read the statements coming out of the Russian government, they really are going to open up Russia to North Korea. That really is the plan. If you do that, because you're operating from such a low base of economic development with North Korea, even just Russia will make an enormous difference, would be my feeling, and will really do an awful lot of damage to the fairly extreme conditions that the sanctions have imposed. Just looking at some of the North Korean economic data, there's not much. You basically can get GDP growth and you can get imports and exports. But even with just this, it can tell us something. As far as I can tell, prior to 1998, the data starts around 1990. Prior to 1998, the economy was just an absolute freefall, sinking around 4% a year in real terms. That was the period, I think, of the famine in the 1990s. But then even when it gets out of the famine, from about 1998 onwards, the average rate of GDP growth in North Korea looks to be about zero. If these numbers are in any way accurate, and from kind of seeing, I have actually kind of researched North Korea a bit, and you can tell some things about the level of development, and it does appear that outside of Pyongyang, it's pretty much a rural economy of small peasant farmers, really. So that would probably be the type of economy that doesn't really grow. I would be surprised if Pyongyang doesn't grow a little bit. If you see photos and stuff of it, it's actually, at least the central parts look quite, they look quite well built up, really. So there must be some construction growth and so on there. But overall, I think 0%, an economy that basically doesn't grow isn't a terrible baseline. Now, when you start looking at imports and exports, this gets a little muddy because imports and exports have absolutely grown. They're very low. I'll talk about that in a moment, but they have grown. So if imports and exports are growing, the economy is probably growing. So that does make you wonder. I'm looking at the source there on that GDP data. It's from the South Korean central bank. So that may be propaganda, to be honest. But I think that is a kind of a base case that it doesn't grow that much. And maybe it grows a little bit, and the imports and exports are probably out of Pyongyang or something like that. But even if you look at the level of imports and exports data will be reliable, because for every export a country sends out, another country is an import. So you can always double check import and export data. It's more reliable than perhaps the South Korean estimates of annual GDP growth. But just to give some sense, so North Korean exports in 2022 are $300 million. If people don't work with economic statistics all day, they'll be like, okay, what's 300 million? 300 million for a country is like crazy low. So just to give a sense of that, North Korea has a population of 26 million. South Korea has a population of 51 million. So North Korea is half the size, population-wise, as South Korea. South Korean exports in 2020, I guess we have 2024 data, are 58 billion. So 300 million versus 58 billion. I think that's, if I can do the maths in my head, that's probably about, it's less than 1%. So you have a population that's half the size, and your exports are less than 1%. So that gives a sense of the absolutely crazy numbers that you start to see when you look at the North Korean economy. So again, that just emphasizes. I mean, think of it that way. So I've said that they have 1% of the, less than 1% of the exports of South Korea. Okay, population adjusted, less than 2%. Yeah, if on per capita basis. Let's say you just, quadruple those exports over the next couple of years because Russia starts buying widgets or weapons or anything else. Okay, that'll only bring it up to like, 8% on a per capita basis as South Korea. Right, it's still really poor. But can you imagine what it would do to an economy to like quadruple exports over the course of 4 years? It would completely change the nature of the economy and maybe even the nature of the society itself. So I think this could be a really, really interesting economic experiment. We almost saw something like this before with Cuba when the Obama administration almost went in the direction of lifting the sanctions on Cuba. And Trump was actually considering going along with it, as far as I understand it. And there were a bunch of hardcore Cuba hawks in Florida who pushed back on him, probably via Marco Rubio and so on. And so the sanctions were never lifted. But even then, I don't think it would have been as interesting as North Korea, because Cuba's natural state in the world is to be kind of a playground for Americans, like to be a tourist spot for Americans. That's what it was in the Batista regime. That's what it was pre-Castro. And that's what it would revert to. So incomes would go up. There'd be lots of tourism. Everyone would be sipping coconut milk and smoking Cuban cigars on the beach rather than going down to Florida. But with North Korea, I think it's more interesting, because really what they will be exporting is not tourism to Russia. There may be a little bit of that, but it'll actually be these very low end, probably, and weapons, industrial exports. And it's unpredictable to say what that might do to an economy, because if you get stuck in the tourist trap like Cuba would, you turn into kind of a Greece. It's pretty obvious what you are. It's not obvious when you start a manufacturing behemoth up. I'm not saying North Korea is going to be a manufacturing behemoth, but I'm saying if you start up a manufacturing sector in an economy, it could develop. It actually could develop. There's some hope for it there. So multiple reasons to watch this. And it will also be interesting to watch the Western coverage of it as it goes on. I mean, obviously, knowing from experience now that when the West doesn't like something happening in the global economy, they either ignore it or they make stuff up about it. But it will be very interesting to see if we start seeing dramatic export figures out of North Korea, how the press actually covers that and deals with that.
Milei down and die.
Javier Milei's had a good week. I'd say probably his first really good week since he got elected. When he got elected, just afterwards in last December, he tore the peg, the artificially suppressed currency value of the peso off, like a band-aid in a sense, and he thought that this was going to fix the economy. We were very critical of it at the time, or at least I was. And it gave rise to something resembling a hyperinflation, inflation of well over 200% of GDP. Now, of course, inflation had been already in hyperinflation territory. It had been up over 100% of GDP when he took over, but doubling or tripling inflation in a couple of months like Javier Milei did, it's no small feat. And I mean, my take on it at the time, you can go back and listen to the podcast or read the old articles, is this will probably continue as a hyperinflation or accelerate to like ultra hyperinflation where everything collapses, a 10,000% increase. But even without that, if you have 300% inflation a year, sorry, you're in a hyperinflation anyway. It's just a question of scale at that point, and your economy will eventually destabilize with those type of inflation rates. Well, some good news. So for months, the Argentinian government, who have apparently seem to have a crack PR team, have been trying to say that inflation's coming down. And the way that they've been reporting that is that they've been saying month-on-month inflation is coming down. And what that really means is annual inflation is slowing. So I never paid much attention to that. Of course, it's interesting annual inflation is slowing, but you can't advertise that as inflation's coming down. So it was basically made up until last week. It was spin, it was PR. They should have been saying the inflation rate is slowing. But in May, the new figures out for May show an actual decrease in annualized inflation, down from 292% to 276%. So still crazy high inflation, but that is a real decline in inflation. And if you see that in a hyperinflation scenario, that does indicate that the worst may be over. And I think that's what people are hoping now. They're hoping that Javier Milei did something very, very painful. That was, rip the Band-Aid off and say, okay, we're going to take market forces, allow them to dictate the peso, and that's going to fix our economy. I've never been clear on how that's going to fix the economy, but apparently it will. But, for us people who are saying you're going to create a crazy hyperinflation, destroy your society and economy, you can say, okay, well, now the worst is over. It was only, 6 months or 4 months of crazy hyperinflation that started coming down. We'll get to some of the other dynamics in a moment. But I will say this is enormously misleading. The reality is that last month, the peso's unofficial or black market rate, which is the rate that Javier Milei, as a candidate, used to point to and say, that's the real market rate. The official rate is a fake socialist government, something or other. That black market rate has fallen 15% against the dollar last month. And the reason for that is obvious, because this huge burst of inflation has raised costs, wages, and everything else in the Argentinian economy. And so the currency adjusts. Very basic stuff. So why is the official rate moving away from the unofficial rate? It's quite simple. The Milei government is propping up the peso. He's doing exactly what he criticized his predecessors for. But here's the thing. He's let the genie out of the bottle. There's only so much you can do to prop up a currency. And when you're running an inflation rate of near 300%, you're not going to be able to prop it up. So the ratings agency Fitch expects another devaluation by the end of the year. They don't expect that because they think temperamentally Javier Milei will accept market forces. He's not accepting market forces. That's why the unofficial rate is down 15% from the official rate. They're not making a call on politics. They're making a call on economics. The government will not be able to defend the current peso rate until after the end of this year. They'll run out of capacity to do so, or various other forces will drive them to not being able to do so. And then what happens? You will get another sharp devaluation from the official rate down to whatever the market rate is, and by the end of the year, it might be a lot lower than 15% down, and then you'll get another burst of inflation going through the system. And this, everybody, is how hyperinflations always look. They're always step by step by step. Government trying to defend, stopping, running out of gold, running out of foreign exchange reserves, thing getting out of control. And then the only question is, does it maintain this insanely high hundreds % inflation for the next 3 years, or does it go full hyper up to 10,000% and everything, the nuclear explosion of economics that occurs? But either way, look, unless something magic happens, the peso is going to devalue by the end of the year, as Fitch says, maybe even earlier. It'll be at least 15%. By that time, it could be up to 30% or something. And then Bob's your uncle, we're getting another bout of inflation. So you'll see a bunch of headlines between now and then, if they can contain this official rate. If the government, the big socialist government that Milei doesn't like, can continue to control this rate, between now and then, you'll get lots of nice headlines every month of the inflation rate coming down. Don't buy it. Wait until the peso has to be revalued, as Fitch says, probably by the end of the year.
So, full disclosure here. Firstly, I know much less than you about economics, Philip, so I am not going to question or even add to any of the economic points that you've made. Second, full disclosure, just for our listeners, I have kind of extreme skepticism about whether this form of libertarianism can actually work in Argentina's situation. I know a lot of people out there, perhaps even some of our listeners, really think it can and really believe in it, and are very much in favor of libertarian ideas. Not me. So just bear that in mind when you listen to what I'm saying. I know very little about economics, and I know I'm skeptical, to say the least, about libertarian ideas such as those espoused by President Milei. I would say I would pick up on two things that you mentioned there. It does seem to me that Argentina has really good PR under Milei, and I think that's for two reasons. And by the way, I read a lot of very positive stuff in kind of right of center press in Britain, like the Daily Telegraph. There's actually a lot of really positive stuff there, and I think there is among a certain political milieu in the US as well. So I do think that you're right to say that they seem to have like a crack PR team under Milei. So I think there are two reasons why there's a lot of positivity about Milei. The first reason is that there is a strand in Western politics, but especially in Anglo-Saxon Western politics, that is strongly libertarian in its slant. I think this is derived from what certain right-of-centre people, not what I would call the traditional conservatives, but more modern conservatives, I think it draws from what they see as the golden era of aggressive supply side reforms under President Ronald Reagan in the United States and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in Britain. And they see those reforms as being necessary, revitalizing, energetic. And they actually see them now as a cure for the ills that Britain and America are suffering today. And they would very much like to return to that kind of supply side economic liberalization reform of the British and American economies. You see that encapsulated with by Liz Truss in Britain and Nigel Farage in Britain. And in America, there are plenty of people that you'll know better than me who espouse the same kind of reforms. And I think that they see in Milei a kind of a hero, somebody who's taken on a country with real economic problems and giving the kind of the hard, unpleasant medicine that the country needs to come back and to be stronger with a sound base in the future. And I think because of that, they're really kind of desperate for him to succeed. The other and more hidden factor behind some of the positive headlines that Argentina under Milei receive is the fact that he's aligning himself closely and very aggressively with the United States. Really, very much so. Things like buying in F-16s, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but then that ties you in to the entire US defense infrastructure, and you then become reliant on the US for the defense of your nation, because it's not just a case of buying F-16s. It's a matter of training the pilots. It's a matter of all the spare parts that they need, all of the munitions that they need, all of the avionics and software that they need as well. And if you then in the future upset the US, well, I'm sorry, you don't have you can't defend your country anymore because we're not going to provide you with spare parts. And this is all leverage that the US has used in the past. He's also inviting the US military in to patrol, I think it's the River Panona. I need to probably look that up. It's a major Argentinian river. It is the Parana River, excuse me. The Parana River, it's a major navigable river. It goes into the heart of the lithium triangle in South America and covers some of Argentina's lithium deposits. And he has invited the US military in to patrol that as well. So he's really aligning him, and a whole range of other ways that he's aligning himself with the US, trying to get involved in the Ukraine conflict, trying to inject himself into what's happening with Israel, very much on Israel's side. Of course, Mr. Milei, in his own inimicable way, has said that he wishes or he would like to convert to Judaism, which is fair enough, I guess. But I think his affinity with Israel is more sign of the way that he is trying to align Argentina with the US. And I think because of that, the US sees it as important that he succeed, even though he perhaps goes against some of the Democrat Party and the kind of, the permanent government in the US's own kind of political leanings. I think they've perhaps learned the mistake that they made with Bolsonaro, where in kind of opposing Bolsonaro because they associated him with Trump, they ended up with Lula, who aligned Brazil with the BRICS nations and was avowedly neutral in a whole range of conflicts that the US wanted Brazil to get involved in. They've learned that mistake now, and they're kind of putting a peg on their nose when it comes to Milei's domestic policies and also his Trumpian persona, and they're really investing in having him succeed. So I do expect the positivity around Argentina to be in excess of the actual success that he has with the country. And I also suspect that the US would probably be willing to prop him up in extremis.
That's a really good point, and it really is required to understand the broader narrative of what's going on. I'll just note on the point you just made that it's actually fascinating that, as you say, the entire kind of US elite has swung behind Javier Milei. I'm old enough to remember Javier Milei, hire Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was called the tropical Trump, if anybody remembers, and he was loathed. He was absolutely despised in DC. I actually thought it was ridiculous. I thought, geez, you guys have a guy here. Why don't you take advantage of it? So I think actually they've kind of come to realize that. Now, maybe that's because Biden's president. And so if Biden's able to kind of sign off on Milei, then Milei's okay. But if Trump gets in, you wish, if I were an American, I'd wish American foreign policy wasn't like this, but it is that politicized. We'll see, though. We'll see if Milei stays in the good books when Trump gets elected. Sorry, I should say if Trump gets elected. I think they may have bet on a bad horse here. This has always been my point. I think it was very foolish for the American establishment, if you want to put it that way, not to get behind Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was dealing with a pretty buoyant Brazilian economy. Nothing really strange happened under Bolsonaro. The Brazilian economy hasn't been doing great these past few years relative to some other BRICS countries. But, it wasn't because anything Bolsonaro did or anything like that. His time in office in Brazil was fairly boring. The issue with Milei is that you're bringing in this really radical reformer, as you say. And when you do that, when you bring in somebody that's going to make concrete decisions that are going to have huge ramifications for people's living standards and for financial and economic stability in the country, you're making a huge bet on that guy. What you're doing is you're putting a bet that his policy is going to work. And here's the issue. What happens if I'm right and this whole thing turns into a mess, starting probably at the beginning of next year? Just after Trump's probably president, by the way. So that might be the time at which the media turns on Javier Milei. We'll see. But what happens in that regard? Okay, if Argentina goes flat broke after wave after wave of 100%, 200, 300, 400, 500% inflation, or in an even worse case scenario, we go to the full nuclear option, 10,000% inflation, wheelbarrows of money. Either way, the country goes broke, right? Effectively, that's what happens. And it's going to need a bailout. Now, Javier Milei, as you've said, is very widely seen, both in Argentina and elsewhere, as being a very pro-Western, pro-American candidate, okay? So if he screws this whole thing up, all the Latin Americans, all the Peronists there are going to go, see, we told you so. You got the Americans in again and you had another default, just like we had in 2000, but this one's even worse. And he's going to now drag you kicking and screaming to the IMF, and the IMF's going to try and impose incredibly harsh terms on the country to try and get the inflation under control. And all the Argentinians are going to remember and they're going to go, oh, we've been through this before. And this time, the candidate that's just done it is even more obviously pro-Western and pro-American. I think the logical outcome of this will be that if all this plays out, as I'm saying, Javier Milei's successor, probably a Peronist of some sort, will get in. And this will be the first BRICS bailout. They'll say, we don't want the IMF, but we're not doing what we did in 2000, 2001. We're not just defaulting on our debt. They may default on their American debt, fine. They probably will. But that won't be the core plank of it. What they'll do is they'll say, we want an alternative bailout. We want to try out a new form of bailout, and we want it from the BRICS Bank. And at that point, the BRICS will get to experiment with what the IMF does. And Argentina will be a great test case. Even if it doesn't play out exactly like that, something like that, it feels to me, will happen. Javier Milei, they've made a huge bet on. I think they're going to lose that bet, just like you'll lose if you bet that the peso is going to appreciate or you go and you buy Argentinian bonds right now. Just like you'll lose, they'll lose. And at that point, the reputation for the West and America in Argentina will be shredded potentially for the next 50 years, but at least for the next decade, 15, 20 years. And the Peronists will ride back in and they'll put Argentina back on track to join the BRICS because Javier Milei took away the application. They'll put that back on and they'll heavily integrate.
Don't believe your von der Leyen eyes. Listeners will be aware that last week the elections for the European Parliament took place. It caused some waves in the media, certainly here in the UK, I'm sure in Europe, and perhaps even in the US as well, because the populist parties, and especially those on the populist right, parties like AfD in Germany and Rassemblement. Shall I have another go at that French word? I think it's Rassemblement National, but I'm probably butchering that. I'm sorry my French brethren, but my French pronunciation isn't upright. Marine Le Pen's party, I should say, to make it easier, really made tremendous gains in this European election. It was billed in the West as further evidence of the onward march of the populist right in Europe. There was lots of hand-wringing. There was lots of pearl-clutching, especially among the European elites. However, I would like to offer a different take on this. And that is that this election doesn't really matter at all. What does it matter at all? It doesn't. It's not going to be such a big deal. Why do I say that? I'm going to give you 3 reasons. First of all, the first thing that you have to understand is the European Parliament in Strasbourg, or sometimes in Brussels, as it is, isn't really a legislature in the way that you and I think about legislatures. It's not like the House of Commons or the House of Representatives or the German Reichstag. It's actually not like that at all. The European Parliament doesn't initiate legislation. It doesn't write legislation itself. It consults on it, and it has the ability to potentially reject it. It often doesn't, but it has that ability in theory. It has the ability to suggest amendments, but it does not write legislation and then vote on that legislation that it's written. That's done by the European Commission, which, as we know, is headed by Ursula von der Leyen. Okay? So that's the first reason. These are elections for a parliament, which isn't quite a parliament in the way that we think it. It's closer to the setup of Bismarck's Second Reich Parliament. Okay, the Reich, that it's not quite in the way that we think it as it is a parliament, and it doesn't have those powers. The second reason is that European elections, certainly in Britain, but I think in Europe as well, are traditionally not taken as seriously as national elections for national legislatures or general elections in Europe. Quite often, it's a way that voters vent and protest in general. If people remember, just before Boris Johnson won a big 80-seat majority, the biggest majority of any Conservative government since the 1980s, just before he did that, the Conservatives were absolutely wiped out in a European election. These things often have much lower turnouts. They create much less interest because people realize that they don't count for much. And they're often a kind of a platform for protest votes to take place. Now, do I deny the fact that right-wing populism is on the march in Europe? No, I do not. I just don't see this election as an indicator of that. The third and most important reason I don't think that it matters so much is because the European elites, if you like, I know that sounds conspiratorial and I shudder to go down that path, but the people who really run the EU are kind of the heads of state within the more respectable parts of the European Union, the kind of the centre-right, centre-left parties, in combination with the heads of certain EU bureaucratic hierarchies like Ursula von der Leyen, like Charles Michel, like Christine Lagarde, who's head of the ECB. They're the people who really run the EU with their permanent bureaucrats. And they have very swiftly and very predictably, as Thomas Fazzi explained in an excellent article for Unheard, which I recommend everyone look up, they have very swiftly moved to essentially block any effect that this new centre-right populist wave might have on the European Union's workings, legislative programme, everything. They've very quickly sought to tie up all of the heads of major bureaucratic hierarchies within the European Union through backroom deals so that they're set in place, and therefore the EU agenda is set in place for 5 years, long before the populist right can make any further advances. So for that reason, I don't think that this is as big a deal as people are making out. And I think that the press is making far too much of it. European parliamentary elections don't matter so much.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is largely right, but the two things I think are kind of connected. So, yes, of course, the system works as you say it did, but the reason that they're now getting very aggressive to ensure that the higher level bureaucracy remains under control, not to sound conspiratorial, but it is literally under control of a bunch of bureaucrats and pliable politicians. But, the reason they're rushing for that is because they're scared that the populist parties will start to take over in the national legislatures. And that's exactly what you're seeing in France. So after Macron's En Marche party lost very badly to Rassemblement National, he called a general election. We won't go into that. We could have done a section on it. It was a very strange thing to do. Macron seems to be unwinding more and more by the day. But they effectively, it looks like Marine Le Pen's party could take over in the parliament, in the parliamentary system in France. Now, parliamentary system isn't that strong in France. It's a very kind of elected monarch country, elected monarch being the president, being Macron himself. But if he loses those national elections, there's a lot of talk that he might actually have to resign at a certain point. He might have to resign. So that's kind of spooked them. So while you're correct that the parliamentary elections in and of themselves don't shift the balance of power, not directly anyway, they can indirectly with their capacity to actually rubber stamp who the bureaucrats get to be or who the president gets to be or so on. But you're correct. I think it just scared the life out of the establishment there, and they're really worried that that the politicians, the populist politicians at a national level, will start to get traction, which they probably will, because the Le Pen polling at the moment looks like this wasn't just, vote for the wacky Le Pen in the European elections as a protest vote, as people often do, and then vote for a more normal party in the national elections. Polling is suggesting that is not the case. People are willing to vote for Rassemblement National for French Parliament. But, to highlight or to almost to buttress what you're saying about the it doesn't matter, we can actually look at the other aspect that was in Thomas Fazi's essay, and I've been tweeting about it all week. In fact, I've been tweeting about it before because I've been highlighting that this is becoming the game plan for everybody. It grew out of taking down Liz Truss's government, but the shortly after the elections, the election was called in France. The French government debt went absolutely wild. We saw a bigger one-day move. It was a 6 standard deviation move, and we've only ever seen a bigger shock than that in March 2020. That's when the pandemic started. So the markets have absolutely flipped out at the prospect of Marine Le Pen getting anywhere in French politics. Now, just to say, some people are going to come at me and say, they've said it to me on Twitter, that basically Le Pen has a big spending program you don't understand, and the markets are rationally reacting to Le Pen's spending program. I can't go into it in detail, but I don't think that is true. I think the markets are just reacting. I think the European elite, conspiratorial, yes, but it's true, are just stirring the pot. They're putting out loads of negative stories about the French economy. All those negative stories about the French economy just appeared, popped into existence. They didn't exist before. And I said on Twitter, if Macron had come out and put down in front of the French public Rassemblement National's economic policy platform, I don't think the bond markets would have freaked out. I think this is a bit of a game to scare the bond markets. Now, how would you do that? Basically, you're threatening to take away ECB backstopping. ECB backstopping's been there for the debt since the 2011 sovereign debt crisis in Europe. And basically, the implicit deal is market yields will never get out of control anywhere in Europe, no matter really the debt to GDP or the deficit, the government deficit, because the ECB will sit on them. And the ECB can do that, just like the Fed can do that, just like the Bank of England can do that domestically. So the real question that's being put in the minds of the bond markets is, will the ECB respond or not? And today, on the day of recording, the ECB chief economist, Philip Lane, the ex-Irish central banker, downplayed the need to intervene in the French bond market. Now, just remember, there was a 6 standard deviation event, the largest since 2020. And the ECB chief economist comes out and he goes, no, we don't really need to intervene. He said the sell-off in France's debt does not meet the criteria to invoke central bank's emergency powers. Translation from European Commission, European blob speak. we're not bailing you out unless you do what we say. That's the deal here. We probably saw it with Maloney too, and a lot of us missed it. But that's the deal here. And that's going to be the deal everywhere now. They're going to use this. They use the same playbook to get rid of Truss, and they're going to use this. They're going to try and use this same playbook, in my opinion, to try and get rid of Donald Trump if he becomes president too. You scare the bond markets. You raise questions about whether the central bank's going to ride to the rescue, and then I don't think they're going to try and overturn an election like what happened with Liz Truss, although she wasn't elected, fine. I think what they're going to do is they're just going to lean on Le Pen. They're just going to say, look, you're scaring the bond markets and we can control them and you can't. So either you're going to have a big crisis presidency or you're going to kind of get with the program and rule normally. So I think that's what we're saying. So I do agree with you, like at a very macro level. I think this stuff doesn't matter because the bureaucracy is just completely in control. But at a more micro level, I think the reasoning here is that they see the European parliamentary elections as a kind of a signal of what might happen in the nationals. But once you understand the kind of chicanery around government bonds and the central bank, we're back to the Andrew Collingwood position of it doesn't matter.
Look, I agree with all of that, actually. I think in the long run, it would matter because eventually through national elections, there will be a critical mass of heads of government, essentially, that can start to influence the machinery of the European Union and turn it their way, despite the fact that they will have huge resistance from the permanent bureaucracy within the European Union's mechanisms and administrational hierarchies. It will be difficult, but eventually they'll reach a critical mass where they can start to influence things. At present, though, they're not there, despite the fact that they have Hungary, they have Slovakia, they have the Netherlands now, they will probably have France soon, and probably not Germany. But there are key states there, and enough so that if certain elections go in certain ways, you might see a critical mass within the next 5 or so years. But it's not there now. In the meantime, what's going to happen is the centre-left and centre-right elites are going to use the European Union because of the constitutional supremacy of the European acquis, essentially European law, over individual national laws, no matter what the learned men at Karlsruhe in Germany claim, and in Poland have claimed in the past. That is the case. The European Union treaty law does have supremacy over individual constitutional law within nations. They will use that. They will essentially use their ability to control the application of that to slow down the march of the right at the same time as the ECB uses its control over money printing, essentially within all of these countries, to achieve the same end. I think that is what they're doing, and that is what they'll continue to do. And I think because of that, the right, the populist right in Europe, and potentially even the populist left in some countries like Spain, Portugal, Greece, etc., have a long way to go before they're able to exert control over the European Union. And because of that, it'll continue going with the same agenda as it's currently got. But I think you're right. They are running scared. They are starting to play a lot of these cards. We saw it before with the way that Berlusconi was removed in Italy. We saw it again with Meloni in Italy. We saw it with Greece as well. We might have, if what you say is true, Philip, be seeing it now with Le Pen in France. And indeed, there have been certain shifts in Le Pen's policy positions, especially insofar as foreign policy and alignment with the US and NATO and all of that kind of thing. But because they are doing this, they do have a huge amount of power and a huge amount of leverage over these individual countries. And it would be extraordinarily difficult for them to say, well, look, you're doing this to us. You're going against our democracy. We're leaving the euro. We're leaving the EU. That ain't going to happen. It's like too difficult to do that overnight. It's not like in the US calling a bank holiday until you can recapitalize some of the banks and therefore propping up the financial system. It would be truly chaos. So there is a lot of leverage there, but I think, because of that, the centre-right and the populist right has a long way to go yet before it can start influencing matters. You've been listening to Multipolarity. Subscribe or follow for fresh episodes every week.